Hi again everyone, this is a continuation of the previous video that we covered, software technologies for gaming. So in the previous video we covered dependencies, operating systems and drivers, and on this video we're going to look at application software, scripting software and sound and graphics APIs, along with a description of the overall task that you need to do. So we'll start off with application software. So while this sounds a bit like you should be talking about things like Visual Studio, if you look at the specification, it actually asks you to be talking about the languages themselves rather than things like Visual Studio or whatever you would use to make programs using these languages in. So we'll start off with Java, not to be confused with JavaScript, which we'll cover later. And Java is object-oriented, class-based programming language, and it's about 20 years old. It's reasonably popular still, and it's quite similar in terms of the way it works to C++. And generally what you find with these programming languages is that once you can program in one of them, you'll be able to transfer that across multiple other types of programming language, because actually ultimately this is logic-based stuff. Also, when we come to describe this, you don't actually have to use this languages yet. That will come in different units. This is all about descriptions. Okay. Now, Java is quite commonly used for programming languages for things like Android, and generally things like its ability to execute on a client machine. So, a client machine is, if you think of it as what you are watching this video on, is a client machine. The video, or where I'm recording and storing the video, is well, it's not a server, but it could be a server. Like a website, if you think of it as you looking at a website, is a client. Where the website is stored is the server. So its ability to execute on a client is going to do things like making it much faster. It's going to do things that you wouldn't necessarily be able to do otherwise. However, sometimes it won't necessarily help, particularly if you want to kind of store your own data. However, those are certainly useful things for it. C# is a reasonably new programming language developed by Microsoft. It's quite common to use C# as maybe one of the first programming languages that you develop, because it's a lot more accessible. Now you can get C# and you can develop C# using things like Visual Studio. Visual Studio is now available free as a community version of it out there, available for you, that you can use to do lots of different things, not just C#. You can use ASP.NET and all sorts with it. It's a really nice bit of kit. It is designed to be reasonably accessible, and it's designed obviously to create programs for Windows. However, you're not constricted by that, but that is generally what it's used for. Now with C#, it will do things like use a debugger before you actually save and run it, so that will make sure that there are no errors. That makes it a little bit more maintainable, because if you know there's no errors in it, then you'll be able to add on to it later on. And also, when you're developing C#, you'll find that the actual interface, especially with something like Visual Studio, is much nicer and easier to use than something like a C++, which is very kind of text driven, and it looks it's difficult to describe it. It's a bit harder to actually get your head around, really. C# is something that you might do on a level 3 course. C++ is something that you might do on a degree course, or Java is something that you might do on a degree course, whereas like C# is something that you could use on level, well, I've known students on level 2 do it, along with something like a Python. Now Python isn't in the spec, so you don't necessarily need to talk about it. These are the only 4 that are listed within the spec, so we're going to stick with these. C++ is very old, nearly as old as I am, which is a scary prospect. And it was basically an extension of C. C is a system language, and one of the nice things about C++ is it has a collection of predefined classes. Now, you may not be kind of recognizing what I mean when I start talking about things like classes, but if you've ever used code before, a class is almost like something that you can use. It's like a set of commands, I suppose you could say. So, for example, if a user performs action, then do this. And the fact that it has predefined classes in there means that you don't have to code it yourself, and that can only be a good thing. So the fact that it has these predefined classes, you can use these multiple times within the code, and that's going to help you speed up what you're doing. It also will reduce things like errors. But C++ is harder to use. I mean, ultimately, I said it was created in 1985, and it's not the easiest thing to use. And you've always got to remember that where it came from, they wouldn't have had any of this graphical user interface like we know it these days. It would literally have been line by line by line by line. And that's pretty much how you code it these days. Now, the final one is Java Edition Micro Platform. Just rolls off the tongue, which is designed to create portable and mobile software. So, for example, if you have a bit of software you want to create for a mobile phone somewhere, you might decide to use this. I'm not going to lie, this is not something that I've used a great deal. It's relatively new because ultimately mobile software is relatively new, especially compared with C++. But you might use something like this to do something on a mobile device. However, Java, I'll get it right in the end. Had to think about this. This is what happens when you get old. Java is still the more widely used out of the two of them. Now, scripting software. JavaScript is probably one of the most widely used programming language out there, and the reason for that is its use with the World Wide Web. So you use JavaScript as part of one of the three key technologies with web development. So the three key technologies of web development are HTML, Hypertext Markup Language, CSS, which is Cascading Style Sheet, and JavaScript. So HTML structures your web page, lays it out, CSS makes it look pretty, and JavaScript makes it do something. So JavaScript is very popular because of this. And if you think about the growth of the web recently, JavaScript is everywhere. Vast majority of people have some kind of JavaScript interpreter on their machines, whatever it might be. It's also relatively forgiving. So HTML as a whole is relatively forgiving, especially compared with some other languages. And it will try to do what you program, whereas if you're using some of the earlier languages we discussed, you may find that it will just be computer says no, you've coded it wrong, you have a missing semicolon somewhere in your 400 lines of script, therefore it's not going to work, whereas JavaScript will at least attempt to do something. Unreal Script was developed for Unreal Engine. Now, despite this being in the spec, and at the time that the specification was released, this Unreal Script was being used. It has since become discontinued. So it's a bit of a funny one, really, because I think just if you try and describe, how Unreal Script, or what Unreal Script was, but ultimately you won't need to go into too much depth with it because it's not being continued. They're simply going straight to C++, and their reasoning for that was that Unreal Script is based a lot in C++, or based around C++, so therefore it just makes sense to use C++ rather than making something else and then making it a lot more complex. You've got Maya, which is used for 3D software, Maya, and this is designed to speed up repetitive tasks. So if you can imagine a 3D piece of software, you may decide, or there may be things that you need to do again and again and again and again, and the idea is that by using the script you can set up almost like a macro, I suppose you could say, and it will repeat things that you do over and over and over again. That will speed up your coding. ActionScript is used predominantly with Adobe Animate, or you may be familiar or more familiar with it as Adobe Flash, and it improves the functionality of that piece of software. So with Animate you create animations, obviously, and within there, you might need to give more complex commands than simple do something called a motion tween, which is basically where you make, or you give the illusion of an object moving across the screen. But actually you might want to do something a bit more complex than that, and you might want to add some scripting behind it. So for example, if a user clicks on this button, then perform this action. Or if the user clicks on something, if they don't need to click, it could be as basic as a rollover, or they could be doing something like a quiz, and they're keeping count of what the end user is doing. ActionScript is very similar to JavaScript in the way that it works, but it isn't so forgiving. So if you make an error within your ActionScript, it's simply not going to work. However, your animation will still try and play, but you'll still get errors coming up all over the place, which isn't so good. Although Flash isn't supported by Flash or Animate aren't supported by Apple products, they are still relatively well used to create things like training videos. So for example, a little while back I went for a job interview at Oxford Airport, and they used Adobe Animate to create training packages for pilots, and things like I've forgotten what they're called, but they control the flights coming in and out of the airport. I'm sure there's a fancy word and I can't think of it right now. But this is how Flash is more commonly used these days. Finally, we're looking at Sound and Graphical API. So API stands for Application Program Interface. And you've got three things that you need to talk about: OpenGL, which is the Open Graphics Library, which is designed to help you render 2 and 3D graphics. And then you've got OpenGL ES, which is for embedded systems. So this is more common, and you can usually use it with things like video games and other kind of elements linked to that. DirectX, now this used to be very common when I was a lot younger. There used to be DirectX coming out everywhere, and you use it to help you kind of control things like media, video and sound on your system. So finally we'll move on to the task, and within the previous 2 videos we've obviously covered quite a lot of stuff, and the task we used to create and deliver a presentation on the topics that I've just covered. Now what I don't want from you guys is essays on your PowerPoints or presentations, whatever you decide to use. That is not how a presentation should be. What you need to do is use key points on your slides and be able to expand off them. Okay, I do not want you to be reading off the slides, and we'll discuss this more within the classes themselves. You'll do it in groups of 6, and I'll decide those. And obviously keep the presentation length to a maximum of 10 minutes. So we'll discuss this in more depth within class, but just be aware that basically everything in the previous 2 videos you'll need to cover within your presentation, and you'll need to keep it to a maximum of 10 minutes. Okay, thank you. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.